welcome to this discussion where we'll be talking about a new book by two young people, Harsh Madhusudan and Rajeev Mantri. It's called A New Idea of India, Individual Rights in a Civilizational State. It's a lovely book. I enjoyed reading it. There is a lot of thought here, which we'll get to as we progress. I have three short opening remarks. First, Harsh and Rajeev, I have enjoyed reading your book. It brings multiple conversations together into a cohesive argument around what can be seen as rediscovering the civilization of India and placing it in a modern context. It's a passionate book full of vigor. It's also a thought-provoking book with interesting information and perspectives. They challenge the status quo, sometimes a little brash, sometimes mature, overall highly entertaining. Second, I don't think your book will be a bestseller. Your book will be a super seller. I mean, yesterday, Prime Minister Narendra Modi tweeted this. Over the past few days, I have been reading A New Idea of India, Individual Rights in a Civilizational State, by two bright minds, Harsh Madhusudan and Rajeev Mantri. Their work makes rich contributions to intellectual discourse. I hope you read it too. There was a surge of traffic surge that you tweeted after that. So as finance people start counting the money, what we are looking at is some, let's say 2% of, if Prime Minister Modi's followers, if 2% of them buy your book, it is already 1.2 million copies sold. So be prepared to count the money. Third, I believe because of the 2 points above, capturing the current discourse and Prime Minister's endorsement, your book will impact conversations around India, and with good ideas comes great responsibility. Be prepared. Congratulations once again and best wishes. This evening will progress as follows. I will first invite both of you, Harsh and Rajeev, to make your initial comments in 5 minutes each. Please keep them to 5 minutes, and I'll tell you why later on. I will next invite Shamika to critique the book in 7 to 10 minutes. This will be followed by a short discussion among us. And finally, and that's why I want to keep you guys short, I will open it to the intellectuals gathered in this room for their questions and their comments. So over to you, Harsh. You are going to be, I'm going to ask you a pointed part about the book, which is tell us about the civilizational discourse. Rajeev will then take us through the economic discourse. I hope that's okay with you.
Well, let's do the reverse. I think Rajeev wants to go first, so let's do that first.
So Rajeev, you go first. Tell us about the economic discourse within the civilizational context that you talk about in this book.
No, so Gautam, can I go over the first couple of chapters, which is the civilizational part, and then Harsh can take over on economy and governance towards the fourth and fifth chapters.
Do that.
So first of all, thank you to Observer Research Foundation for inviting us on this platform, and thank you Gautam for moderating it. We are very happy to sort of be in expert hands, and thank you to Shamika for participating with us. And moving on now about the book. So if I had to summarize the grand thesis of the book, our view as we present in the book is that India is a continuing civilization. India was not invented in 1947. So there has been a strain of thought for many decades since independence in India, in like academic scholarship, in popular discourse, that somehow India was created. India was kind of fabricated almost after partition happened, and thanks to the work of the first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, Shashi Tharoor, a prominent sort of member of parliament, intellectual author, he wrote this book back in 2003 called The Invention of India, which is a biography of the first Prime Minister. Nehru's niece, Nayantara Sehgal, has also written a book called Nehru Civilizing the Modern World. So, and these are just two examples of a lot of writing, thinking, scholarship that has pushed this narrative that somehow India was not really a nation, that India was a collection of communities, and it was Nehru and his successors who in fact tied it all together and created a modern nation state. So that is why Harsh and I sort of offer an alternative view and different theses in the book, that in fact India is a continuing civilization, and the events of 1947, partition and then independence were just one more milestone in a very long civilizational journey that stretches probably many millennia in the past. So that is, I think, the big sort of point that we emphasize in the book. And uh, the first chapter of the book is titled India, that is Bharat. So that chapter concerns itself with philosophical issues, actually. It's a high level sort of overview of Indian philosophy almost. And we tie together how dharma is the defining sort of totem or the defining sort of feature around which India is actually constructed, and it should be recognized as such. Probably many of the leaders of the independence movement, starting from Gandhiji himself, recognize this. And they in fact drew inspiration from figures of the past, like Chhatrapati Shivaji, for example. So, as we point out in the book, it's no coincidence that Shivaji's book called Hindavi Swarajya was titled Hindavi Swarajya. He gave the slogan rather Hindavi Swarajya, and then Gandhiji's book was titled Hind Swaraj, which he published in the early 1900s. So even the leaders of India didn't see themselves as inventing India at that time, but somehow we've been fed this narrative that India was invented in 1947. So this idea that dharma is key to India's sort of a defining feature of Indian philosophy, a defining feature of Indian even governance, I think needs to be recognized. And for too long, intellectuals in the country have denied this. And one of the sections, Gautam, as we were discussing earlier, is called The Gaze of the Cocooned Intellectual, where we make the case that for too long, stories of India and views and analyses and narratives about India have been dictated by those who are outside India. Now, there's nothing wrong with non-residents or those who are outside India writing about the country, obviously. But ultimately, it's up to Indians. It's up to those who are having a greater stake in this country to decide who are we and what do we want to be. And I think we are slowly moving in that direction. So, long ways to go, but I think we have made a lot of progress on that actually in the last decade, especially. So, moving on from that particular aspect, we then talk about society in India, where our case is that for too long, government in India has seen individuals as members of groups and not as, individual, having an individual identity. So, everyone in India is viewed by government as you are of a particular religion, or if you're a particular caste, or you are from a particular gender. And our case is that the Indian government or the state, more broadly, generally speaking, should view the citizens of India as individuals, and rights should be based on that sort of unit base rather than of like a particular group. Obviously, that sort of then flows into social policy and also economic policy. In the social sense, that means having, for example, a uniform civil code where there are equal personal laws for all citizens of India. And in an economic sense, that means retrenching the state from the role of a business sort of participant and making it have a more regulatory, facilitative role.
Your 5 minutes are up. You have 60 more seconds.
Okay, so I'm just concluding. Then in the third chapter of the book, we delve more into politics, and this is where I'll just touch upon it and then hand over to Harsh also. So this is probably the most controversial one in the book, and maybe that's what you meant when you said brash. But we made the case in a very cut and dry fashion of how the word secularism, and particularly the idea of secular as properly understood in the West, has been perverted in India. It is in fact a debasement and an Orwellian construct that we see in India, where religion-based discrimination is talked of as secularism. So we've given a fact-based kind of narration of how different governments at the state, in the different states and at the union level have all perverted the idea of secularism, and why it is important to, in fact, salvage secularism from the secularists. So on that note, I can hand over to Harsh, who can delve into how individual rights tie into the economy, and finally, in the last chapter, the importance of administrative reform and governance changes.
So thank you so much, Rajiv. Thank you once again, Gautam, obviously ORF. Thank you, Shamika, for attending. So I'll just continue from where Rajiv left. So chapter 4 of the book is called, profit is not a dirty word. And the last chapter of the book, chapter 5, is called Decolonizing the Indian State. And then we have a conclusion or epilogue called India's Moment. So how are these two different books? They are not. Whether it's the social civilizational side or the economic policy state capacity side, we are constantly saying that the default should be individual rights, should be what in the West some people might call small c, small l classical liberalism. However, we have many exceptions to that, which is where we diverge. So on the civilizational side, there's a chapter called Kashmir, Pakistan, Karl Popper. So we'll come to that later. And similarly, while the general thrust of the book is towards free markets, towards letting incentives and the profit motive let entrepreneurs run and make us a larger economy sooner and faster, there are a couple of exceptions we highlight. For example, with under the slogan of Atmanirbhar Bharat, Atmanirbhar capitalism, where we do think we do present a nuanced view on industrial and trade policy. And I think there are very few people in the country who understand the industrial trade tech policy geopolitical aspect than Gautam himself, who's written a paper on 5G Hawaii and what that means for India's technical security going forward and all the supply chains behind that. So we say that it's in that as a default, internally we must have freer and freer markets. We must let the profit incentive rule roost. Famously, Jawaharlal Nehru, our first prime minister, told J.R.D. Tata that don't talk to me about profit. Profit is a dirty word. When J.R.D. Tata had talked to him about whether the PSUs are profitable, are they loss making, and if the latter, why so? And we still continue to have a bit of that hypocrisy around profit in India, especially in education and healthcare sectors, where we say no, these sectors are too sensitive. There should be no profit. And when we say let profit allow, we do not at all mean that there should be no regulation. Of course, there must be sensible facilitative regulation, as Rajiv had hinted, but the idea remains that if you do not let profit incentives, you do not increase quality and do not decrease cost. For example, a lot of studies have shown Indian budget private schools give slightly better results in Indian government schools at 1/3 the price. There have been randomized controlled trials to that effect. And one can do similar analyses for the healthcare sector. So there's a lot of kind of hypocrisy around the profit. But what does that mean? It does not mean that this is a kind of binary argument between minimum government, therefore that's all profit, and big state is bad. No, what we say is we need a scalpel. We don't need a hammer. The state needs to be powerful and strong in areas that matter. For example, establishing the monopoly on violence, policing, judicial reforms, sensible regulation. We were just talking recently to Sanjeev Sanyal, who very beautifully articulated the difference between supervision and regulation, and why we need rule of law, but in some cases at the highest level, we do need discretion, because you cannot actually account for all possibilities. So we need a good regulatory state which broadly allows free competition. Which one area where we disagree is let India leverage its size to have temporary moderate tariffs to incentivize manufacturing in India, including by foreigners, including by multinationals. And that because you have allowed almost 100% FDI in most sectors, with some sensitive sectors like which are exposed to Chinese investment being the exception, you are nowhere doing what some people have in our view wrongly called license Raj 2.0, that oh my god, we are back to import substitution. That not at all. You have allowed a completely integrated, thanks to GST and infrastructure, domestic market with almost full FDI, as opposed to throwing out Coca-Cola in the 1970s, etc. Famously George Fernandez had done so, part of the Janta government. So by allowing foreign investors, but there's this bit of a foreign wall that please don't import directly from South Korea or China. Try to manufacture here, be it cell phones or cars. And in fact, you know what? For some time, we might even give you time-bound production-linked incentives, even export-linked incentives if they are WTO compliant going forward. That industrial and trade policy is very important. And linked to that, however, is the issue of state capacity. Because when you have such nuanced interventions to be made, economy, you need better administrative capacity, better qualified and better paid top level bureaucrats, so that this does not devolve into cronyist lobbying, but actually helps the developmental state of India take off, just like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan did. And we must remember the geopolitical tailwinds as far as India is concerned in all of this, because just we are now in a soft alliance. We're not in a hard alliance with the United States. We're in a soft alliance within the League of Democracies, and therefore we will have some tensions, but we have an export market of the broader West, which is why we did not join RCEP. And Rajiv and I agree we should not have joined RCEP, because RCEP is practically an FTA with China. We already have an FTA with ASEAN. So we need free markets with some exceptions. We need better state capacity. We have written about education and healthcare in the last chapter. We've written about foreign policy, how economic growth is the best foreign policy, but we need a much better foreign service cadre, and the current foreign minister is working on that. We've delineated many umpteen small reforms, like in the Indian railways and here and there. The digitization wave, which increases the legibility of the state for the citizens, which allows targeted welfare without quote unquote leakages. That very Indian euphemism about retail level corruption, which we call leakages. We are basically reinventing state capacity. And Rajiv, me, and many of the viewers, I'm assuming Gautam and Shamika, we've lived in some parts of the world. I have not seen many financial kind of bank transfer systems which are as smooth as India's today. In some ways, even advanced countries are not as frictionless when it comes to certain financial technology enabled transfers that India has already achieved. So we need to double down on technology based governance. We need to remove discretion at all but the top bureaucratic levels. And we need to make sure that we have both cooperative and competitive federalism. Because what we are doing in GST is cooperative federalism, but we also need some competition between the states. A very large country like India cannot be centralized, and even within the states, I think urban governance is crying for reform and some kind of direct mayoral kind of system, because that's the lived reality, not just of the elites, but increasingly of more and more of India. And by the way, India's urbanization numbers are definitely understated. If you go back any international comparable numbers, we have a very strict definition of how we count in a census. We are much more urbanized compared, if you do a like-to-like analysis, compared to other countries. So we think that the state capacity is important for economic growth, and is this modern democratic state, which is transforming this millennia-old civilization into a coherent nation, whereby I and Rajiv, we can be from North India, born in Calcutta, working in Bombay, going to school in Bangalore, and we do feel intrinsically we are part of the same community, namely the Indian community. And it initially started with the IAS, ironically, when they were the first all India elite, with the Bengali IAS officer working in Rajasthan and vice versa. But now that kind of logic has gone to the private sector as well. And that, so economic kind of growth leads to social harmony and bonds and intersectionalities being created, not to use a woke word there. So I really think that is how we need to move, go ahead forward. And finally, the one big state capacity reform that's happening is defense modernization. Because you cannot ever be a real superpower if you're importing weapons, which India has been, because we have been delaying the important because of the urgent. Just like in this case, also to some extent, we had to suddenly rush to Russia because of the Chinese issue. But nonetheless, this government has increased FDI limits in defense. They are increasing private participation. And I think we finally have the beginnings of what a different president in a different country with a different connotation had called military industrial complex. But we do need a benign military industrial technology, because without that, the spillover benefits of those technology R&D and research and development is a point I think Shamika speaks often about, and we'll probably hear from her. There are civilian and commercial spillovers of often defense R&D. The internet is actually a DARPA invention in the US. And there are many kind of health tech and med tech spillovers from research that was done for defense purposes. So we cannot just be a consumer there; we have to be a producer there as well. Even as the ease of doing business rankings for India have improved dramatically by dozens of places in the last 5-6 years, one area where we've done very terribly is the ranking in contract enforcement. And if you think about it, ultimately what happens is, this again shows how the economy and societies are very beautifully interlinked. If I do not trust contracts, commercial contracts in India, as an average businessman, I tend to do business within my quote unquote religious or caste community, because there is no paper that I can trust which can be enforced relatively painlessly. As you have more and more of a formalized system which can rely on India's judicial and quasi-judicial institutions, formalized businesses tend to do business across their communities and thereby create that social capital in a Robert Putnam sense. I think that is very important, not just for economic growth, but that's also very important for social harmony. This is a classic case of not enough state capacity harming both sides of the ledger, the civilizational and the economic. So I think, and there's much to do about judiciary in terms of who are the judges appointing. In India's judiciary, the judges are appointing themselves, unlike, for example, the United States or many other democracies.
Well, congratulations, guys, Harsh and Rajeev, and to all the folks who have joined in. I strongly recommend that you pick up a copy of this book. In fact, a lot of what is being addressed from the reforms perspective goes beyond one or two sectors. And what I like is that economy here is not just macro indicators that they're restricting themselves to, which is the appeal of the book. They have really looked at the real economy, which includes various different sectors, therefore the discussion on judicial reforms, but also human capital, technology, trade. And so it's very important to pick up a book like this, which chronicles very well what is happening contemporary sense in the country. For me, the great learning was in terms of all the distortionary policies we've had on the religious front. And by that I mean, the chapter on secularism for me was particularly revealing because while I'm aware of a lot of the big ticket and we do know of some of the more high profile issues of distortions, what I liked about the chapter was they have really gone into minute details of management of religious institutions vis-a-vis the state. And it's important because this book is really about individual rights. And for me, that is the big appeal, because a lot of economy and the reforms is about improving individual liberties. And that is the sort of the broader philosophy that many of us like to take when we study a particular aspect of the society or the economy. What does a particular policy do to individual liberty? And from that perspective, I think this is an extremely informative book. Now, let me start from that point. For me, the book is about individual liberty. So I did some research of my own in terms of secularism and the way we have approached it in India. Now, if you look at the debates in the Constituent Assembly, the terminology used was Sarva Panth Sambhav. Now, Panth is very different from Dharma. And even today, our Constitution talks about Panth Nirpeksh. But in the popular parlance, on the common narrative, whether it is amongst the politicians, but also journalists, and therefore the public intellectuals and everyone else who talks about secularism, it has become one of Dharma Nirpeksha. So I think that is one dissonance, or the cause of dissonance. The second is Sambhav has been dropped somehow. Sambhav is equanimity, whereas Nirpeksh is really sort of a detachment or looking the other way. And that again becomes another point of dissonance. So it's important to highlight how much can be lost in translation itself and why language matters. And this is an earlier discussion we were having on why language is very important when we are thinking of the relationship of individual vis-a-vis the state, when we are thinking of important aspects of an individual. Economy, you don't live in an economy, you live in the society. Religion, or whatever practices you might have in your life pertains to that aspect of life. So language becomes very important, and these sort of original points of distortion or dissonance gives you an insight into why we have strayed, and sort of a diagnostic of where we are today. So I think it's important to talk of equanimity of the state rather than a detachment from religion. And the reason that is the case is because, detachment also means detachment from the cultural moorings. So state cannot be absolutely, orthogonal to cultural moorings of the society. And I think that is where this new conversation that we are seeing, and this book I think will be leading the way in that, is a very welcome and an important one. Now let me get back to the area that I have spent last 25 years of my life, which is studying the economy. Now, when we think of the many different distortionary policies we had, despite the very good intentions of our forefathers and mothers, or the founding fathers and mothers, particularly under the initial, first couple of decades. For instance, the Prime Minister Nehru had excellent intellectuals who were advising him. So it is not just lack of knowledge. So when Mahalanobis says that India had one of the most distortionary or the most expensive labor laws, he's writing in the 60s or the late 50s, when clearly, and he has the years of the Prime Minister, the PM knows about it. And yet we go on to implement a minimum wage legislation, which is very, very high. So now we are well intentioned, but we are setting the bar so high in the society that the cost of doing business or creation of wealth and growth is becoming disproportionately expensive in a society which is fundamentally very poor. So many of us, we are still having that debate even today. And this is to the authors, Rajiv and Harsh, that sometimes perhaps then it's not lack of good ideas, but perhaps the institutional setup, perhaps it's the politics. And this is where we have not yet gone. And I think your book does do justice in the mid part of it, in addressing the uncomfortable politics around some of these issues. So I think it's a very important one. Now, just stretching the Mahalanobis and the labor cost issues vis-a-vis Pandit Nehru's era, we can also think of more recently the Narendra. Narendra for us is a very important program. In fact, in the middle of a pandemic, it has become almost like the central vehicle of welfare. Because a lot of people who have gone back into the rural areas are eventually finding succor in the form of workfare through the state and so on. We studied the Narendra in the early several years. These are very, very rigorous econometric studies. And we found that while Narendra has indeed had a very big impact on poverty, so it has elevated poverty, it has also raised labor costs across rural India, which means that a lot of micro businesses, small businesses which hired labor, for them it has become very costly now to do business. So what we have attained in the form of equity or in terms of reducing poverty, we have also paid a price in terms of loss of growth. Because even a small parchun shop or a small doodhwala who has perhaps one cow or 3 goats or something, they are all producing some wealth. So when we raise the cost of that, we are fundamentally moving the economy away from jobs and creation of wealth into a redistributive, more it's a state transfer sort of a policy. So these are problems we have dealt with, we are still dealing with. Sometimes I think that from the individual liberty perspective, which is such a fundamental point sort of addressing this entire problem, it becomes one of, India always sets its own costs very high. We are making the cost of, and I don't want to say doing business, because that picture you have is of a businessman or a woman. It is just wealth creation. It is just the simple act of having a livelihood. It just becomes more and more expensive. And I'm glad you have put in so many examples to that. The third point is the APMC, the agriculture reforms, which we have all written about, and something we believe in, something we have been writing and reading about from when we were in primary school. And yet today, of course, there is the politics of it, but let's stay away from the politics. Bihar and there are a couple of other states have already abolished APMC. So there are lessons from that. Bihar abolished APMC in 2006. So what is the lesson? Well, the lesson is, and this comes to a fundamental aspect of the book which talks about the role of the market versus role of the state. When you dismantle a state apparatus like APMC, it does not mean the role of the state is not there at all. You cannot leave a vacuum expecting market forces to suddenly fill it, because that doesn't happen. There are entrepreneurs, but it also needs, market needs the government, the facilitating institutions. So whether you have weighing centers, agriculture market requires a lot more than just production of vegetables and food items. It requires the sale and the purchase requires an entire logistic support. Bihar government, when it removed the APMC, fundamentally stopped investing in agriculture of these markets. So while farmers did see an increase in wages overall, they also saw huge fluctuations in wages. Mm-hmm. Now wage fluctuations are terrible. So now if we do a partial equilibrium analysis, then we are likely to believe that, look, when state was removed from agriculture and we left it to individual entrepreneurs, so gave farmers more liberty or individual rights, it led to greater uncertainty and greater risks in agriculture. So the very important lesson there is, even in free market, there is a basic role for the state to play, which it cannot abdicate. But more economic reforms means the role of the state is just getting narrower, sharper, and it is getting redefined, but does not mean no state. So I think that's a very important clarification. In similar vein, I love the example of JAM. The Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile, something again we've been writing now for 6-7 years now. It's important because while Jan Dhan and Aadhaar were state initiated and state managed programs, mobile was almost entirely private sector driven. And that tells you that something basic and in the infrastructure of doing subsidies or improving the basic architecture of the economy, you need both the state and private players to achieve certain minimum infrastructure to be able to come up with market solutions and state solutions. The third and the last point I want to leave you with is individual liberty is a great angle to look at an emerging market like India, because almost all are reformed, at least from the way I look at it. I know markets fail, healthcare, education, gender. In many aspects of human capital, we do know that markets fail and there is a role for the state. But a lot of institution building, a lot of development of a society requires fundamental institutions. It's not just hospitals, schools, etc. The role for philanthropy becomes very important as well. Because if we are saying that we should empower the individual, it also means individuals in the society who are more fortunate, the expectations from them also rises. So when we look at the West, when we look at, and you have in your book highlighted several universities, several global high-ranking universities set up by the state, but it's equally important that the very rich and mighty, who were the robber barons or oil barons, etc., in the early stages, they also gave back to society in the form of Chicago University. I mean, you have Carnegie Mellon and so on. We need that kind of a larger sort of impetus here as well. And when that doesn't happen, the onus on the state just increases more and more. The individual is often looking at the government to fill that gap, especially in health and education. Because I think philanthropy needs to be redefined in an emerging market like India. It can no longer remain about religion alone, and which is why I think the mid chapters on religious institutions doing education and health are so important, because it fundamentally needs to redesign what is missing. As far as it's not just that state is managing a lot of Hindu religious institutions and temple trusts, but it's also, why is it that there is such an increase in terms of the growth rate of whether it is the Muslim population, whether it is Christian population in India? What is it that they are being offered? So today, now we are talking about bills, we are talking about anti-conversion laws, etc. But what is the pull factor? And
Shamika, I want you need to conclude.
If you can, address that a little bit in terms of how you see, in terms of individual liberty, the role of philanthropy, particularly in religion, towards these market failures like health and education. And again, once again, I conclude by saying, highly recommend the book. I do hope all of you will read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shamika. Shamika, you need to write another book, which we will discuss here, because all your ideas are so fascinating and thought-provoking in themselves that perhaps we need a full-on session with you on those. I want to take it somewhere in a different direction. You mentioned Nehru and Mahalanobis, and Rajiv and Harsh have written a lot about Nehru's policy. Now, my question is simple. What Nehru did versus what Nehruvian thought has become today. Is there a gap? Is there a bridge? Is Nehruvian thought what Nehru did and the policies that he made? Or is Nehruvian thought strayed away from what Nehru did? I mean, Nehru surely can't be the bad guy of Indian policy making.
So I'll take a stab at that. I think I'll take a stab at it. Thank you, Gautam. Thank you, Shamika, for that excellent exposition. I'll take off from where Rajiv had left. Rajiv had quoted Mr. Shashi Tharoor's book called The Invention of India. Interestingly, Nehru himself wrote a book called The Discovery of India. So that itself tells you that Nehru saw himself as discovering. You discover something by definition which is pre-existing. You invent something which is not pre-existing. So there by itself, you can immediately see the difference between Nehru and Nehruvians. And there is nobody more articulate and Nehruvian today, I would say, than Mr. Shashi Tharoor, who we are very privileged to have actually we have gotten a recommendation from him on the book cover, of course, with the usual caveats, but we're still very fortunate to get the recommendation. So the fact that Nehru saw it as discovery and Nehruvian see it as invention tells you all the difference you need to know on the civilizational side. And I'll come to the economic side very quickly. Just on the civilizational side, I'll add, there is a speech. There are many speeches he gave which can be analyzed, but the famous speech he gave at Muslim University, 1948 January, just a week before Mahatma Gandhi was murdered. And you remember Aligarh Muslim University was ground zero of the partition movement, of the Pakistan movement, intellectual zero of the elites of Muslim elites of the minority province of upper provinces of Uttar Pradesh. And Nehruji there goes and says, when I look at the history of India, when I look at the beautiful, amazing heritage, I feel like my blood is pulsing faster. I feel this sheer thrill. Like, do you like share that thrill with me? I'm just paraphrasing. And of course, the question that Nehru poses to the students of AMU, at least those students who've decided to stay back, it is a rhetorical question. Because obviously he knows what the reality of AMU was just a few months ago. But he wants to somehow, in the interest of harmony and perhaps his own vote bank politics, but at least in the largest sympathetic explanation of harmony, somehow reconcile these in the Indian traditional synthesis. So that's the difference between Nehru and Nehruvians on the civilization side. On the economic side, just touching from where Shamika very rightly left, she gave the example of Mahalanobis already mentioning about the labor laws. I'll give another example of how Nehruvian economics later came to be perceived and how it actually became license Raj, partly because of political compulsions. Now, the rupee, like all currencies in the 1950s, was fixed. All currencies were fixed. There was no floating exchange rates in the 1950s. You had Bretton Woods, and only after the 1970s were there floating currencies. So you had devaluation at a particular point, and otherwise a straight line. Now, what happened is because Indian inflation was much higher, as an emerging economy, we were doing debt monetization, deficit financing. Our real currency rupee actually appreciated because the nominal rate was fixed, but our inflation was higher. That made our exports absolutely uncompetitive and made imports much easier. And what happened was, because we were also a democracy, unlike other emerging economies, the value of the rupee versus the pound and the dollar was a prestige issue to kind of attribute to the political aspect that Shamika hinted at. And there was no kind of appetite to devalue the rupee. So since you did not devalue the rupee, the most commonsensical way of addressing that problem, which finally happened in 65, 66, what happened is we started clamping down on imports through administrative fiat. When you started clamping down on administrative imports, then you said, okay, let's not get these expensive imports. And from that import channel backwards onwards, the license Raj actually started in India. Because we said, you will not actually have this much increase in supply. You will need permission to buy this, to increase capacity, to import this. And then, of course, it had its own constituency of corrupt bureaucrats and politicians. So it actually started off from a very different place. Like import substitution did not necessarily have to mean license Raj even back then. But because the currency was not flexible and the politics made devaluation difficult, so that Nehru idea initially of a more kind of a mixed economy by Indira Gandhi's time had become almost a quasi-communist economy. So that there, and then when 1991 happened, people were afraid and looking over their shoulders that okay, fine, we have to do this, but how do we do this without saying explicitly that we are junking Nehruvian economics? So I think that those are two good examples of how Nehru and Nehruvianism differ, both on the axis of civilization and economics, and on the other points about philanthropy and religious state, non-state actors. I'll let Rajiv address Shamika if Gautam thinks that's correct.
No, let's stick to Nehru for a while. I wrote that book last year, 70 Policies That Shaped India. And in the process of writing that book, I was able to see the political economy, the politics, the intent, the ideologies that drove the economy of India. I found no evidence of bad intent. Every policy that when you go back into the papers that led to its formation, at worst, the worst you can say is that they were misled. That's it, nothing more. I think every Prime Minister of India has wanted India to rise, to become good in his or her own way. And yet, today, Nehru is being looked at as though he he is the reason for the slowdown in India. He is the reason because India is behind. Indira Gandhi made it worse, and so on. I think this narrative in your book, it's not there in your book, by the way. I mean, I'm not saying, but your book should have perhaps balanced it with. You see, we are probably confusing Nehru and Nehruvian.
No, actually, that is precisely the point we make. Actually, Gautam, in the book. In fact, on the economics side of the book, we do say that like some of Nehru's ideas, it was obvious by the 60s. Actually, by the mid 60s, it was clear that it's not working.
So we sort of got stuck in time, you would say?
No, so it all comes down to politics actually. So if you now with the sudden passing of Lal Bahadur Shastri ji, it's one of the great what ifs of history. Had he lived as Prime Minister, continued as Prime Minister for a full term or maybe beyond that, what would India have looked like? Because he was far more of a pragmatist and less of a dogmatic sort of thinker than Indira Gandhi. And actually, there's a if you go back to the period of the late 60s, so Indira Gandhi was obviously being, there was a faction within the Congress trying to suppress her, trying to control her. And, they had installed her in the hope that she would just be a puppet, but that really didn't turn out to be the case. And then,
digressing away from the book, I want to
actually, this is important.
The book right now.
Just to emphasize the politics of it, actually. So, Morarji Desai was removed as finance minister when he opposed bank nationalization. So, he was against bank nationalization and he was removed as finance minister, made a deputy prime minister, and he promptly resigned. And then the Congress O was formed, I think. The Congress, Morarji, and there was a Congress organization which Indira Gandhi kind of headed, and that is when she allied with the communist parties because her government had become a minority government. So Indira Gandhi allied with the communists, and then those ultra left ideas kind of seeped into the government because of that kind of partnership between the left parties.
They got branded as Nehruvian thought, so to speak, and
to be sure, Indira Gandhi embraced them fully, right?
It has nothing to do with the Nehruvianism. So
Indira Gandhi embraced those policies fully and drove that forward for a good 7-8 years. So I mean, fair to say that, and if she's the flag bearer of Nehruvianism, then fair to say that the policies are Nehruvian.
Okay, let me take you to another direction. Constantly I am, and perhaps you are as well separately, I speak for myself alone. I'm constantly called right-wing, conservative, and earlier I used to be called left-wing, liberal, etc. So I don't care about anybody who labels me. That's their problem. But your book has gone into a little more detail than left-right. My view is that any Indian, when we examine it from the civilizational point of view, can neither be left nor right. I think there is just far too much layering in every Indian, and I believe in every citizen of the world, in every human. By Indians more cannot be boxed, but we are being forced into boxes by a limited intellectual, let us say, expression, limited labeling. So anytime you say you oppose somebody, you become that label. When you support somebody, you become another label, and so on. Please, and you have explored this left-right business, and perhaps you've called it left and non-left. So what's going on here?
Okay,
Yeah,
so
Harsh can
I'll
take that, I think.
yeah, okay, I'll answer that. No, actually we haven't called it left and non-left. We've actually started the book by calling there's a part called a note on labels in the very introductory part of the book, and we say actually while out of convention, some people do call the BJP as say a right-wing party, and the Congress is a center-left party, and then the Congress is far right, and some Hindu fringes as far right. But this is just a copy-paste of the Western kind of framework. In India, especially, it does not apply for the very simple reason that the basic fault lines in Indian politics are very different. Now, for example, if there is somebody who opposes the BJP but wants different laws for different religions, wants one gender to be able to marry more than once and the other gender not to be able to marry more than once, then should we call them left, progressive, liberal, secular because they oppose the BJP? It would be absolutely absurd. And that's not a hypothetical proposition. There are a large number of people like that. Similarly, on the so-called right-wing party, the Modi's government first term was a lot about the last mile welfare delivery, including the jam trinity, but more broadly about sanitation. You have cooking gas and so on and so forth, electrification first at the village level and then at the house level, and basic rural roads, which to be fair has been happening from earlier governments as well. So is that a classic libertarian, free market, Reaganite, Thatcherite argument? No. It is about making sure that there is state capacity which goes to the last most unfortunate person. It's almost like the Gandhian talisman. It's almost Deen Dayal Upadhyay level. So sometimes you actually have to believe people when they say it, that they are not actually right-wing capitalist. So in Indian sense, either on the economic side or on the civilizational side, this right-left does not apply. Yes, on the core issue of there are some people who do not want to acknowledge the civilizational identity of India. They construe what I think is a false divide between civilizational patriotism and constitutional patriotism. Whereas we think the two are interlinked. In fact, civilizational is deeper. Constitution is a topsoil. They like to present them as orthogonal. Whereas if you go by the constitution, any constitution can be amended by the right procedures, and directive principles have uniform civil code. They even have cow protection, which Gandhiji spoke about. So, sometimes people are perhaps defending an imaginary constitution, which they like to believe that this is something that they are following, but they're not. So, and even there, while it might be symbolic, the words, at least the words secular and socialist, were introduced in the constitution during a dictatorship of Indira Gandhi, which we euphemistically call emergency, when all the opposition politicians were in jail. So we must understand that, you cannot say that this is a fait accompli of the Indian constitution. And if you want to legally discuss it and change it, I'm sorry, that is fixed in stone because, hocus pocus, basic structure doctrine of jurisprudence. So there are a lot of hypocrisies in the discourse. And if you recently read the Pratap Bhanu Mehta article in Indian Express, where he uses the term judicial barbarism. And he basically says that, earlier the courts were not perfect, just one sentence, but now these are the issues of them not being uniform enough. Well, that's exactly what we write in the book. They've never been uniform. It's just that if the shoe is on the other side from a partisan lens, and we are not partisans, we are not affiliated with any party, we are not members of any party. I'm sure Rajeev is also not, unless he's not told me. So I really think it's important to understand that a lot of the angst now is simply because of the Nehruvian state. Again, not Nehru's state. The Nehruvian state's angularities or deficiencies in the rule of law, while they are being filled right now, are nonetheless being deliberately or otherwise used or abused to a limited extent in a large complex democracy, including by state governments. To be fair to Pratap Bhanu Mehta, he acknowledges that. And there are many state governments who can discuss that. So it is very important to understand that, there are very, very big nuances, as you said, between Nehru and Nehruvianism. Left and right in India just does not have, I personally think it does not even have.
Yeah, even in social policy, actually, Harsh.
Yeah.
So what
it's
we
like
talked
about.
So let me bring Shamika into this discussion. Shamika, this left-right business, of course, I don't think you are a believer in that, in those labels either. But another theme that they have, the two authors have explored in this book is nationalism, and it comes again repeatedly. And do you think nationalism is left-right? And if so, what is the economic nationalism? Is economic nationalism necessarily import substitution? Is it necessarily Swadeshi? Can you just quickly go over this question?
And what a difficult question it is right now, Gautam, given the winds of change globally. If you believe there is this big game being played from a game theoretic perspective, you as a country have to determine your best response to what is happening in the world. So that is number one. So if the world is becoming more protectionist, that is number one. Also with China and its form of economic policy, the kind of economics that China believes in, and the kind of global order from the economic perspective that it believes in, it is impossible for a country to believe in free markets and free trade against that reality of global economy. I think that is very important. The second is that, today, and I think a lot of our free trade theorists are not giving us the evidence on, I know free trade and globalization has done so much for India. We have lifted millions of people out of poverty, but clearly we are few of the countries that have gained from it. There are many that have lost from it. That is the churn. That is the kind of, any free trade, whether it is from a global trade perspective or even when you're thinking from within countries, creative destruction of the type that emerging market like ours are going to foresee, we must be prepared to either relocate, either retrain, but eventually make place for the people who miss out. And we will see people missing out. And in our case, of course, absolute poverty even today remains a very big objective. So we are not anti-globalist at all. But what we do know is that from a longer term perspective, we have to leverage the fact that we are a big domestic economy. Why should we give that up? I think that would be foolish. Second is this, and we need to keep reiterating this, Gautam, Rajiv and Harsh, repeatedly to everybody at all platforms. Atmanirbharta is not protectionism. Atmanirbharta is self-reliance. So that not just on strategic sectors, but as the global, economy is in turmoil, we become self-reliant in a way that now, we are not stuck in the kind of situation or dependence on one or two countries, particularly our, neighbor to the north, because it strategically would be very myopic in the belief of free trade to do so.
So along with civilizational and social labels, even economic labeling is undergoing a major disruption today. And it's, of course, being led by the two largest economies, China and the USA. India is getting there. I'm afraid time is narrowed down, and I don't know how this discussion has ended so fast. I thought we would be just heating up, but there is a time constraint. I just want to say one thing and then leave the last word for the two authors. One is that your book, Harsh and Rajiv, comes very interestingly. The theme of your book is in tune with two other books that have come recently, which I have read and which we have discussed in ORF. First is Jaishankar's book, The India Way, in which there is an entire chapter which all of you must read on the Mahabharata. It's called the Krishna's Choice. Brilliant, beautiful author, beautiful chapter where he talks about how Mahabharata is influencing foreign policy or influenced in the earlier part, and he just describes it in a very elegant manner. And the second book is Vikram Sood's book, The Ultimate Goal, where he concludes that India needs to manage its own civilizational narrative to control its own destiny. I think you are, I don't know whether you have read these books, but the ideas are resonating, they are similar, they bounce off each other and sort of complement and sometimes even question one another, but you are part of that narrative, that theme that's going on. And I think 2020 could be the year where although it's been coming for some time, like Amish's books and even Sanjeev Sanyal's books have come. So I think there is some form of a momentum gathering around an alternative intellectual discourse, which you have very beautifully captured in one of the earliest chapters, or was it the second chapter? I don't recall, in your book, and articulated it with a whole lot of passion and a little bit of angst, if I may say. To conclude, tell me, Rajeev, in one sentence, what do you think? Give us a 30-second elevator pitch to speak your language of finance. The one sentence, what do you think the civilizational India, a modern Indian civilizational state is?
Well, the civilizational state, I guess, would be I think technological. It would be modern but traditional.
Harsh?
That would be my pitch.
Yeah, I would say the Indian civilization is all about synthesis. It's about getting opposites, harmonizing them together. And so long as different views have mutual respect and they don't have this crown of exclusivity, anything can be in that sense Indianized, dharmicized, or Indicized. So I think that is ultimately the Indian way, and I feel that Indian universalism is going to be the theme of this century, and it will be the only universalism which will not be homogeneous. It will allow for heterogeneous strains, and I think that will be the contribution of India.
As is the case in India. Yes, already the case in India.
Profound words. Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Rajeev, and thank you, Shamika. I'm very serious. You should write your own book very soon, and we wait for it. Thank you,
Gautam. Thank you, Shamika. Thank you, Gautam.
Thank you, Gautam, very much. Thank you, Shamika. Thanks a lot.